balloons. Hey, these blow up into funny shapes at all?
Well, no, unless round is funny.
Welcome to the Hollywood in Toto podcast, the right take on entertainment. The HiT cast offers a weekly look at Hollywood from a conservative point of view. Sick of media bias infecting Hollywood headlines? Tired of stars insulting your views? HiT has your back. Now, here's your host, Christian Toto.
Welcome to episode 131 of the Hollywood in Toto podcast, the right take on entertainment. This week we're talking with film historian Chris Yogerst. He's working on a new book about Hollywood propaganda battles in the 1940s, and he's got plenty to say about the Hunt's cancellation. That story is not going away, nor should it. Well, this week we got a story that spoke volumes about Hollywood, the media, and the culture at large. Kind of a perfect storm. Of course, I'm talking about Will and GraceGate. If you missed it, the stars of that hit NBC sitcom suggested we should out the folks who were donating to President Trump via a Beverly Hills fundraiser. Eric McCormick, who plays Will, he lit the blacklist fuse, but Deborah Messing, who's Grace, she really threw gasoline on the fire. Now, why does that matter? It's pretty obvious. Hollywood conservatives are already on the run in the industry. They hide. They pretend that they're not conservatives, or they don't speak up because they're afraid of losing gigs. It's a real fear. It's not conspiratorial. It's the real deal. And Hollywood, in case you haven't remembered, has its own problematic history with blacklists. Think late 1940s, early 1950s, the Red Scare, Orson Welles, Charlie Chaplin, some big names got caught up in that Red Scare situation, including Dalton Trumbo, who Hollywood can't stop making movies about. Now, what happened next was almost entirely predictable. The media ignored the story, ignored the blacklist angle, ignored the fact that Eric McCormick and Deborah Messing were saying we need to dox people for giving to a certain cause. Then President Trump tweeted about the matter and had some mockery to aim at Deborah Messing, and of course then the media covered the story as Trump attacks poor Deborah Messing. Well, hacks are going to hack, right? But that's not all. The media, like I said, ignored that blacklist angle completely until an unexpected source rose up and set out the truth. I mean, who saw this coming? Whoopi Goldberg on The View eviscerated Team Will and Grace for their blacklist wish. Yeah, that Whoopi, that View. Well, bravo, Miss Goldberg. So what happened then? Well, Eric McCormick and Deborah Messing backpedaled on Twitter. Pretty baldly and badly. And then, of course, the media mostly ignored the backpedal because it didn't look good for the stars in question who are liberals and who hate Trump and who must be supported by the media. It's what they do. Now, just about every ounce of the story was predictable except the Whoopi Goldberg factor. You just know what's going to happen. I saw this coming. I wrote about it. And my one caveat early on was if President Trump tweets about it, then that changes everything and they'll be able to reframe the story. It is exactly what happened. I don't have a crystal ball. I just know the media very, very well. They are corrupt, they are predictable, and they are hopelessly one-sided. The hit tweet of the week should go to Will and Grace, but I'm going to go to a plan B. The amazing Tom Arnold. And yes, I'm putting scare quotes around the word amazing. Arnold used to have a Vice show where he hunted for those elusive Trump P-tapes. Remember that? Well, that show went the way of my mother the car, but he's still on the prowl for tapes, just maybe not that specific one. Here's his tweet. Voters should have seen the 3,000 hours unedited Trump apprentice tape before the 2016 election. Apprentice Donald Trump's cruel, incompetent bigot who lies every time he opens his mouth, at Mark Burnett TV. And real Donald Trump have never called me a liar. I know where MGM keeps the tapes. Voters must see. Now, Tom's tape fetish is very on brand, but it's getting kind of sad, don't you think?
You're listening to the Hollywood in Toto podcast, the right take on entertainment.
My hit tip of the week is Firstborn. Back in the day, I worked for a mom-and-pop video store. Yes, I'm showing my age, but I had a blast at it, and it was kind of my formative years as a movie critic, because when customers would come in, I would do my very best to steer them in the right direction. Typically, that just meant pointing them in the new release section, and they'd pick up the latest and greatest, or not so greatest, but hey, it was new, it was cool, and it was flying off the shelves. But when those movies were out of stock, I had to scramble. So I had in the back of my mind a list of other films, lesser-known films, that I'd recommend and say, hey, I know this movie's not here, but have you ever seen this one? It's not so bad. The movie Firstborn was near the top of my Plan B list. It's a 1984 drama with Teri Garr. She plays a single mom who hooks up with a very bad dude, the oh-so-great Peter Weller. And it's up to her firstborn child, played by Christopher Collette, to pry this jerk from this family, and it's not going to be easy. Now, you don't need me to tell you that Garr is great here. She's always good, but Collette's angsty turn is the real surprise here. You know, he hasn't done a heck of a lot following this film. He's done some vocal work on different projects, but given how good he was in here and how prominent his performance is, I'm surprised he didn't get a lot more roles, or maybe he just decided Hollywood isn't exactly for me. But either way, it's a good movie and a good performance. Now, the drama here is darker. There's some drug use, there are some sexual situations, nothing graphic, but I have to say, I kind of want my kids, when they get a smidge older, to see this movie, because I think it's good, I think it's instructive, and also it's got a lot of 80s goodness in it, the music and some of the fashions. I'm just a sucker for that, so for all those reasons, I really enjoyed watching Firstborn again for the first time in a long time. And just a quick final note on Peter Weller. I mentioned how much I enjoy him as an actor, but he's great here. His character is a jerk. He's a blowhard. He's full of it. He's got dreams of grandeur, but you know he's not going to carry out with it. But you know what? What Peter Weller does with the role is it gives him a little bit of humanity. He's not a complete monster. I actually felt sorry for him at times, and that's what the movie and the performance is even better than you think. Now, yes, this is an older film, came out in '84, but it's streaming right now on Amazon Prime. It's well worth your time.
Don't touch that dial. You're listening to my daddy's podcast.
I've been obsessed with The Hunt ever since I learned about its politically charged plot. A group of elite liberals go hunting for deplorable types, and the deplorables fight back? Where do I sign? It sounds interesting and kind of scary given the tenor of the times. That's one of the reasons why I read a new column in The Hollywood Reporter by Chris Yogerst with a lot of interest. He talks about not just the film being yanked from the schedule, but he connects it to the history of Hollywood for some previous films that were also controversial, and more importantly about the 1940s era of Hollywood, where the industry was being attacked as a propaganda machine and how different filmmakers and different studios fought back. So, naturally, I wanted to have Chris Yogerst on the show. Now, Chris and I go back a little bit. I've been following him on Twitter. I think he may be doing the same. So he was always on my radar. But I've always liked what he had to say about film. And also, he's a film historian. So what better chance to talk about a movie like The Hunt from a fresh and knowledgeable perspective than sign up Chris Yogerst and have him on the show. Now, Chris is an assistant professor of communication at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. His op-ed is a real must-read. You'll find the link to it at the show notes page at hollywoodintoto.com. So Chris and I talked about The Hunt, his upcoming book on Hollywood propaganda circa 1940s, and much more. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Chris Yogerst. Well, Chris, let's talk about The Hunt. I think we all know the basics about the film, the cancellation, but when you look at the situation, is there something that's been underreported so far about it, or maybe things that we need to talk more about? Because I think it has been the point of a lot of discussion, but it's a big deal, I think.
I feel like I was just before we talked. I went on Google News and just looked to see what has been reported, and it really, I feel like the story kind of came and went, and now we're just kind of in this waiting game of what's going to happen with it. Is it just going to go away, or is there going to be some pushback? And I'm very interested to see what's going to happen. I feel like there was a lot of reporting on it, but I feel like I think the silence now is deafening. There's a lot we need to talk about, because I mean, from my personal opinion, frankly, I don't think any movie should really be censored like this, whether I like it or not. But I feel like there's a lot more to talk about. There's a lot more, why, what was the issue with this movie? Why did this come and go so quickly? And I feel like that's a conversation that we need to have.
Yeah, I think one of the nagging questions for me is that when the Hollywood Reporter first discussed the film and kind of teased some of the politically charged elements, they had some very specific, I don't say allegations, but facts in the story. And it's the Hollywood Reporter. It's not Fred's blog spot.
Right,
and
right.
Yet it seems like the filmmakers, the people who are representing the film, didn't say, hey, you got the story wrong, or it needs more clarification. And then after the fact, when it was canceled, the film's director said, oh, yeah, it's not exactly an accurate representation of my film. Well, you should have said that a week ago. Any thoughts on that? Because that seemed like among the weirder elements of this whole story.
Yeah, and that's why I feel like the quiet here is really speaking loudly to me, because there's a lot. I mean, it's strange that there's no conversation going on right now, or at least there's no public conversation. I'm sure there's plenty of talk going on behind closed doors and over email and text messages. But I don't know why they didn't defend it, because watching all the trailers, I find this a very defensible film. And honestly, even with the political stuff in it, I just looked at a bunch of the trailers, what's still up there, and most of them don't have a lot of political connotations. But really, I find the easiest defense of this is, anyone who's been following this story know that enough people, including myself, have written that, this is not a new story. This isn't a new type of movie. This kind of perverted hunt of people hunting people has been kind of a social commentary, at least to the 1920s, maybe before that. And in all of these stories, the hunters become the hunted, and the people that are being hunted end up rising up and taking down this creepy structure. So if it truly is, the political left hunting the political right, maybe the political right wins in this. Who knows? But I mean, that's the way these stories have worked, from The Most Dangerous Game all the way up to surviving the game with Ice-T. So, I'm definitely very curious to know what's going on in this movie.
Yeah, that was my initial thought was, hey, the guys and gals being hunted are the heroes. That's the template. Right. I don't know how you could possibly switch it another way. Talk a little bit about, you said that part of this was about misdirected outrage, which I thought was a rather interesting take on it. And you wrote about that at length. We'll have a link to your story at the show notes page at hollywoodintoto.com. But expand on that. What does misdirected outrage mean in this situation?
Well, the reason I use that phrasing is because one of the things I've been looking at over the last several years in my own research is just is film censorship. And this goes all the way back to when Birth of a Nation came out. And there's a lot, there's been a lot of talk of that movie in recent years, from 1915, the D.W. Griffith film, that is technically brilliant, but appalling because the KKK is the hero in this movie. But even in 1915, that movie was hugely controversial. There was a lot of people pushing back on it. So it wasn't like it was widely accepted in 1915, and now all of a sudden in 2019, we are all woke enough to realize we shouldn't appreciate this movie. I mean, it was controversial from the start. And, that led to some legal decisions that actually interestingly showed that movies don't have freedom of speech protections, but that's been kind of quiet since then. But ever since then, the film industry put in a production code to show that they were policing themselves during the golden age, and then the rating system to give viewers by the time you get into the 60s, over blanketing a lot of history here, but giving a sense of what we're getting into with the movie so that the audiences can kind of police themselves. Should I watch this? Should I not watch that? But movies have long been controversial. And the reason I use misdirected outrage is because historically people have pointed to popular culture for the ills of society. And usually the popular culture is a mirror of society. It's not directing society. And I feel like that's what's lost quite often. Anytime there's something awful happens. I mean, I was in high school when Columbine happened, and they listed all the music and video games people were playing and listening to. And it was the same stuff as all my friends. And we're like, we're not homicidal. Maybe this is an over assumption here.
Yeah, it's a pattern that repeats itself because we often kind of reach out for these things. I was going to ask this late in the conversation, but I think maybe now's a good time.
Mm-hmm.
A few years ago, Harvey Weinstein,
Right.
talked about making a violent movie summit. He said, we have to get the people together like Martin Scorsese and people like myself who make very violent films and say, what impact, if any, does it have on the culture? Do we have more responsibility in our storytelling? And I thought it was interesting. I thought it was at least self-reflective.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing happened, and we know what happened to Harvey Weinstein. But,
right.
The way I've always approached this is if you make a movie that's too violent, too gory, too anything, the people won't come, and it sort of censors itself in a way because the audience will tell you, okay, we don't want this, we want that. But do you think that that's a conversation that storytellers should be having or thinking about? I mean, not to restrict them, but if I'm a Martin Scorsese making a movie, should that be in the back of my mind that I could influence the culture?
There's definitely anytime, something is seen by millions of people, we can't discount it as just simple escapism. Everything definitely has an impact, but sometimes going back to my misdirected outrage, I think the impact is overestimated. And again, with my research, this goes back to the late 20s and early 30s, where there were studies that were trying to prove that movies were going to turn all kids into juvenile delinquents. So they were going after the gangster movies of the time and the really sexy pre-code movies. And all of that stuff was inconclusive because and not really respected, because the conclusion always assumes that the viewer is this automaton, that they're going to see what's in the movie and be like, oh, I need to now go do that. Where there's a whole world of life in between the viewer and the movie where we talk about these things. To your point and to your question, I think it is important that the filmmakers come out and talk about these things, particularly if we know if it's going to be a controversial movie. Political undertones or not, a movie about people hunting people is quite controversial. So I think that some context should be added. And to add to that, in my possession, my profession, I'm a writer, I'm a professor. So education is a huge thing. I feel like we really shouldn't censor movies, but the more edgy it is, we need to talk about it. We need to reflect on it. And I think that's where we can fix this, and we can all grow as people and as a society, and have these conversations instead of kind of sweeping them under the rug, like seems to be happening with this movie currently.
When this whole thing came about, a friend of mine on Twitter said, hey, what about The Last Supper, which was about 20 or so years ago, maybe a little bit less. And it was about a group of grad students who were very left of center, and they were aghast at some conservatives in the culture. And when one came to their house and was about as, sort of obnoxious and horrible as they could, he dies accidentally. And they think, whoa, wait, if we invite people who are very, very conservative and vicious and cruel, wouldn't we be doing a good thing if we kind of killed them? It's obviously a satire, but I'm thinking, oh gosh, boy, if that came out today, it'd be The Hunt 2.0.
Right.
Do you have any? Did you see that movie? I was just kind of curious if you.
I don't think I have, but now I need to.
Yeah, it's not great. I feel like it's kind of surface level, but given the tenor of the times, it is interesting the fact that we kind of think that we're at odds with each other right now. We are to an extent, but it was happening in the late 90s too. So it's not a new phenomenon. For
sure. One of the things that came to mind when you mentioned that, one of the things I always tell my students is that movies are always more some than others, but movies generally, historically, are a window into a time period. No matter whether it's a documentary or a fictional film, if you watch a movie from the 40s, you're seeing people in the 40s. You're seeing the way people talk in the 40s, the way they carry themselves. So if it's something filmed on location, you can see what New York City looked like in the 1940s. And something like The Hunt, that was kind of the point at my last line of the Hollywood Reporter article. How does this not fit the tenor of our time? When people look back to 2019 and they see a movie like this, it's, the rest of those of us who are still around many years from now could be like, yeah, that's perfect. That's kind of what it felt like. But it is satire. We weren't literally hunting each other. Mm-hmm. But it felt like that when you see the outrage online and the bullying online over politics and all of this. It's like, what's next? The Hunt. So maybe we can watch this and laugh at it and be like, holy crap, maybe we all need to dial it back a little bit.
Yeah, no, I agree. And the movie from last year called The Oath, which I don't think was I didn't find it very effective, but it showed a left of center guy kind of losing his cool over the political situation. And he wasn't the villain, but it definitely showed, hey, we all need to calm down. And by the way, I guess you kind of run into millennials. I guess now they're Gen Z is the new catchphrase with the younger folks. From a art perspective, from a movie going perspective, what can you share about them? I mean, and maybe it's unfair to kind of sweep them all under one rug, but I feel like there's a lot of negative stereotypes about millennials, about what they want to see and hear. But you're on the front lines. What are you kind of getting from them, or what's your sense of how they approach art?
Well, it's really all over the map. But I'm generally pleasantly surprised by their willingness to explore material that they wouldn't have come across. So a lot of them are, even just getting them to sit down and watch an old black and white movie in one of my film classes can be. It's always intimidating, but I always feel pleasantly surprised at how well they do. One of the movies I use in my intro to film class, Sunset Boulevard, always wins them over. They're always pleasantly surprised by how good an old black and white movie can be and how engaging it can be. I've had the same success with Citizen Kane. In my mass communication class, I make them sit through in class the Orson Welles War of the Worlds broadcast, because I asked them, when was the last time you just sat and listened to a radio performance? And most of them, it's never. So it's an interesting exercise for them to do this. So even though they're binging YouTube videos, I think they're surprisingly open-minded to different types of mediums, at least in my experience. And I think the same goes for politics as well. I mean, I get a lot of questions too from some of my family where they're like, well, where are your students politically? And I'm like, they're coming of age now where everything is a mess. So they are not in any herd mentality whatsoever. They see all of this and they want anything to do with it.
Yeah, I've heard that the younger generation isn't really even comfortable with labels sometimes. Not so much specific, just sort of being grouped in a category, like maybe they are right of center here and left of center there. So, which is actually rather refreshing. I want to switch gears to the book you're working on. It's going to come out in 2020. It sounds fascinating, and I don't know enough about it, so I want you to kind of fill in the blanks. But it's sort of set around 1941, the Senate investigation into movie propaganda. So you've got far more sense of movie history than I do. That's why I wanted to have on the show. Talk about the book and what it's about, what sparked it, and just kind of wet our whistle here.
Sure. Well, again, this goes to some of the controversial films and the film censorship work I had been doing. I was working on my first book about the early days of the Warner Brothers studio, and I came across a testimony that Harry Warner gave in front of the Senate, in front of a Senate subcommittee, defending his studio and his studio's films. And I knew I wanted to look more into this. And this is a part of history that's really been overshadowed because it occurs in the months leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor. So what was going on in the 30s, for your listeners that don't know this part of history well, is that even though we look at World War II as this widely accepted good war, it was hugely divisive leading up to it. As soon as Germany started invading countries, late 1930s, there was a lot of debate over, do we jump in? Do we not? Do we help Great Britain, at least send them some supplies or not? That was FDR's Lend-Lease bill. That was very controversial. And at the same time, a lot of the Hollywood studios were making anti-Nazi movies. First, they were kind of thinly veiled, like The Black Legion with Humphrey Bogart. And then they get into like Confessions of a Nazi Spy from Warner Brothers, Mortal Storm from MGM, Chaplin's wonderful The Great Dictator. And these are all movies that are seen by the isolationists as potentially pushing us into war. So they see these as propaganda. And there are a very loud select few people in Washington that really can't stand Hollywood. They can't stand the power they have. They can't stand that more people watch movies than listen to the politicians. And they take this investigation on. And of course, as soon as Pearl Harbor happens, it's over, but it was over long before that too. It turns out that the senators hadn't watched any of the movies they were saying were dangerous. So it was quite a funny show. But what's interesting about it is that Hollywood defended very well their product and said, like, we are making movies about what's going on in the world. And they were either directly ripped from the headlines or they were satires, and gave a sense of how silly some of the dictators are. I mean, Chaplin, if anyone has not seen Chaplin's Great Dictator, go watch it immediately. But what this book is, I give the history leading up through the 1930s of how we got to this polarized moment, and then the Senate investigation, and then the kind of fireworks of the senators and the blows back and forth in the media and all of that, leading up to the end of the investigation.
That sounds really interesting. And by the way, when you're doing a project like this, I'm sure there's tons and tons of research, and it just takes an enormous amount of time. But was there something you uncovered that you can kind of share, not to give too much of a spoiler about your upcoming book, but just a piece of information that you didn't know that you thought was really amazing that you can kind of talk about briefly?
Well, one of the things that I found quite amazing and also kind of disheartening is how out in the open prejudice was. I mean, we feel like you turn on the news now and you hear that there's a lot of talk about race. At this time, I found it so hard to believe that the anti-Semitism was so widely accepted. Wow. The leaders of the America First movement, Senator Gerald Nye, who was part of the investigation, as well as famous aviator Charles Lindbergh, openly talked about how the Jews are a problem. And Lindbergh went as far to say that the biggest threat, I mean, this is during, while Hitler is invading other countries, Lindbergh actually says in a speech in Iowa that the biggest threat to this country is the Jews in the entertainment industry. So it's like, wow. And throughout the investigation, there was a lot of this. The reason they were going after all of these moguls and studios, they kept making reference to, well, they weren't born here. They're not really us. So there's this xenophobia that's all over. And when I was at the National Archives, I think it was, I'm trying to remember whose folder it was. I think it might have been Burton Wheeler's. One of the senators had a ton of fan mail, and all of the fan mail was blanketly anti-Semitic people saying, yeah, go get the Jews. You're doing this good work. And it's like, wow, this was a problem. And, you grow up hearing about World War II and the anti-Semitism in Europe, and I didn't realize how deep seated it was here as well. So that was quite surprising.
Yeah, I think when you think about that era, especially films from that era, I think about the movie Race from a couple of years ago, the Jesse Owens story. We focus on the discrimination against black people, and we're stunned it was so pervasive and so in your face and so awful. But I think that's something we didn't realize, how the sort of an awful cousin to it was the anti-Semitism at the time.
Definitely.
Chris, I wanted to wrap up with sort of an odd question. I follow Hollywood. I'm from the right. I kind of cover things from this perspective, and I see a lot of TV shows and movies really kind of rejiggering their content to be more openly political, to send a message. And again, from my perspective, it's their right. It's their shows. If the shows succeed, great. If they don't, they'll have to kind of recalibrate. But do you ever sense or fear that sort of that maybe people on the right might want to revisit a propaganda-style attack on Hollywood, that's saying, hey, you're throwing all this money and effort into this. It's clearly one-sided. We need to stop it. I mean, do you think that sensibility could kind of rise up again?
Yeah, I would never rule that out just because people have emotions. And when politics are attached to that, one of the things, with my Senate investigation book, I mean, it didn't end there either. I mean, we had the HUAC investigations in the 40s and 50s. You had the juvenile delinquency investigations again in the 50s. The stuff occurs, and it's been a while now. So actually, now that you mention it, I wouldn't be surprised if it happens again. But I feel like if it happened again, it would still be equally as silly, because I think the way to combat that is not really with government intervention. It's more with engagement and discussion. And I think that as much as you see And I feel like people are a little gun shy where they make really quick assumptions about movies. Oh, if it's coming out of Hollywood, it's going to be awful. But there's a lot of great stuff too. I mean, there's always been polarizing movies, and there's always been movies that, bring people together. And sometimes, one or the other gets more attention. So I feel like, there's, particularly in this day and age where we have access to so much stuff, and particularly so much film history is resurfacing because of that. There's so much to engage in. So if there's something, particularly like The Hunt, if you can't stand the idea of this movie, then don't watch it. Let it go by and find something else to enjoy, and then enjoy that with your family and friends.
We're recording this the same week that the new Dave Chappelle special came out, and it's been sparking tons of conversation. But I think that's the happy accident, or that's the result of having a free society, that these comedians, these movie studios put out product, and we talk about it, and we wrestle with it, we agree, we disagree. And I think it's one of the best things about the Chappelle stand-up act is that it just provoked so much thought and so much putting us out of our comfort zone. And I think sometimes that could be the best result, where we kind of just say, hey, wait a minute, I need to kind of double check my preconceived notions. Maybe I wasn't exactly right. But
that's stand-up comedy at its best.
Yeah, exactly. And when you think about the great comedians of the past, who do you think of? Richard Pryor,
Carlin, Lenny Bruce.
They're the gods, and they're the ones who made us the most uncomfortable at times. So,
yep.
Excellent. Well, Chris, I appreciate you joining the HiTcast. Keep an eye out for his upcoming book. There's no title yet, coming very soon, but it's about the 1940s and motion picture propaganda, so I can't wait to read it. And also, you can follow his film writing at his site, chrisyogerst.com. That's YOGERST. And on Twitter, at Chris Yogerst. Again, all the links will be on the show notes page. And appreciate your time, Chris.
Thanks, Christian.
Well, thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out HollywoodInToto.com for both the show notes and, of course, the latest entertainment news. Please follow me at Twitter at HollywoodInToto. And we'd love it if you leave a podcast review over at iTunes. See you next week.